The night was unusually still, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes every small sound feel like an intrusion. I had just finished a late shift at the convenience store in rural upstate New York, the one tucked along a stretch of Route 12 where the highway lights fade into near nothingness. The air smelled like damp leaves and the faint tang of smoke from distant chimneys, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. My car, an old Toyota Corolla, rattled slightly as I started down the winding back roads toward my apartment in the town of Canton. Normally, this drive was nothing, maybe 20 minutes at most, but tonight felt different, and I couldn't explain why. The stillness seemed heavy, almost aware. The first indication that something wasn't right came about 10 minutes in. I saw a figure standing at the edge of the road where the trees curved close enough to touch the asphalt. My first thought was a hitchhiker, but as I slowed, I realized it wasn't human, or at least it didn't move like a human. Its body was rigid, elongated, almost emaciated, and it wore a long, dark coat that seemed to absorb the dim light from my headlights. Its head tilted slightly to one side, and though the street lamps barely reached the stretch of road, I could feel it watching me. My stomach clenched. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of shadows, a leftover trick of fatigue from the long shift, and pressed on. Minutes later, a tapping began on the roof of my car. At first, I thought it was branches, maybe the wind shaking loose some dead twigs from the surrounding trees. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It followed me for at least a minute before stopping abruptly. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see a branch or some animal darting away, but the road was empty. I laughed nervously, trying to shrug off the feeling of eyes on me. The mist had begun to form, creeping low to the ground, curling around my tires and blurring the edges of the road. Then, almost as if conjured by my imagination, the figure reappeared. This time, it stood directly in the middle of the road. My heart slammed against my chest, and I slammed on the brakes. But my tires barely left grooves in the wet asphalt. The figure didn't move or blink. It just stood there, an impossible shape. Its limbs were long, twisted, disproportionately so, and I still couldn't make out its face, only a dark void beneath a wide-brimmed hat. There was a faint smile, too unnatural to be human. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, unable to look away. Something about the tilt of its head and the stillness of its body made my blood run cold. I felt as if it wasn't just watching me, but studying me, cataloging me. I forced my foot onto the accelerator and swerved around it, praying it wouldn't move, and as I passed, the whisper came. Not audible at first, just a sensation, a vibration through the air. Then it became words. Stay. I slammed on the gas, my little Corolla bouncing over the potholes, the road stretching impossibly ahead as the mist thickened. Trees closed in, their branches forming clawed hands that scraped the sides of the car. Every instinct screamed to get back onto the highway, to leave this stretch of back road, but the fog was suffocating, wrapping itself around my headlights. I had the sudden, terrifying feeling that the road itself was shifting, twisting, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. I finally reached a small clearing, a fork in the road where one path led deeper into the forest and the other toward a faint glow in the distance. I chose the path back to civilization, my knuckles white as I clutched the wheel. The figure didn't reappear immediately, but the tapping returned, now coming from inside the car. My breathing grew ragged. I told myself it was fatigue, paranoia, maybe a loose sunroof latch, but every rational thought was drowned in primal terror. The tapping grew louder, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I could hear nails scraping along the ceiling, slow, deliberate, in sync with my heartbeat. By the time I reached a gas station, I was shaking violently. I could barely step out of the car, and when I did, the air felt lighter, the mist gone, but the scratches on my roof were real. Deep, long marks that hadn't been there when I started. I snapped photos, my hands trembling, but the images were almost worse than the scratches themselves. In the reflection of the Corolla's rear windshield, I thought I could make out that void of a face, the head tilted just slightly, a faint, impossible smile. I forced myself to laugh, tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was reflection, angle, fatigue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been seen, marked even, in a way I didn't understand. Over the next week, the unease followed me. I avoided back roads, and even the thought of dense forests made my chest tighten. But the dreams began. At first, small fragments. Driving again along the foggy road, the tapping, shadows moving in corners of vision. Then they became vivid nightmares. The figure appeared every time, closer each time, its presence pressing on my chest even when I was awake. I would wake drenched in sweat, the same rhythmic tapping echoing in my apartment. I began to notice small things, shadows at the edge of my sight, objects slightly out of place, the feeling of being watched even in broad daylight. Friends suggested stress, overwork, or imagination running wild, but rational thought offered little comfort. My instinct told me that whatever had marked me that night wasn't done and might never leave. One night, alone in my apartment, the power went out. At first, I assumed a blown fuse. Then the stillness hit, heavier than before. The air felt thick, almost viscous, pressing against my skin. I could hear whispers that weren't carried by the wind, voices that weren't mine, trailing just at the edge of perception. I grabbed a flashlight, my fingers shaking, and for a moment the beam caught movement in the corner of the room. There it was. The figure, impossibly thin, impossibly long-limbed, tilting its head in that same inhuman way. The darkness under the hat seemed to pulse, and the smile stretched wider, impossibly wide. I froze. It didn't move toward me, but I could feel its attention like a weight pressing against my mind. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. Then the lights flickered back on, and the room was empty. Everything appeared normal, but I knew it hadn't left. Its presence lingered in the corners, in the air, in my very thoughts. I packed a bag and left that night, staying with my aunt in a small town farther south. Even months later, the events haunted me. I avoided all the back roads in New York. I stayed away from fog-heavy nights. I stopped taking solo night drives. But the whispers followed. Occasionally they would emerge from the edges of dreams or from a shadow that didn't belong. Sometimes late at night I would hear tapping, gentle, deliberate, echoing against my apartment walls. Shadows in corners seemed to lengthen unnaturally. And when the wind died down and the world became still, I could feel it again, the presence. Patient, watching, waiting. I had begun to understand what fear really was. Not the fear of death or injury, but the fear of being seen, understood, and cataloged by something completely alien, something patient beyond human comprehension. It became worse when I began noticing things in public. On foggy mornings, the outline of a figure just at the edge of a parking lot, lingering, tilting its head. In grocery stores, a shadow passing just behind an aisle, moving against the flow of people. Always watching, always smiling. The reality of it gnawed at me. It didn't act like other people. It didn't blend. It didn't disappear except when I looked directly, and even then, I felt its awareness. The sheer unnaturalness of it was horrifying. I couldn't explain it, and no one could help me. I realized I was marked, and the marking wasn't a physical wound, but something that stayed with you, something that never left. I had been chosen or noticed, and once that happened, you never truly escaped. The creeping dread followed me everywhere. On well-lit streets, in crowded supermarkets, even in broad daylight when I thought I was safe, I could feel the attention. There were nights when I felt compelled to drive, to check roads I had sworn never to return to, driven by some impulse that wasn't mine. And sometimes, when I looked in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a figure in the distance, tilting its head, smiling, watching me. It never moved toward me, not directly, but the effect was suffocating. My heart would race, my palms sweat, and I would drive faster, headlights cutting through fog that wasn't truly there yet, chasing some invisible boundary that might keep me safe for a few minutes longer. Then came the night that I finally realized the truth. I had been sitting in my apartment late at night when the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but the rhythm of the tapping started again, now inside my skull, synchronized with my heartbeat. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but the battery died instantly. My lights flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. That's when I saw it, a shadow stretching across the floor, reaching toward me with impossibly long limbs. The head tilted, smile impossible. I wanted to run, but my legs failed. I understood then that this wasn't about harming me physically. It was about terror, domination, a psychological imprint that would last a lifetime. It wanted acknowledgement, recognition, fear. And I could not deny it. I could not escape it. I tried to scream, but the sound never came. All I could do was feel it, in the dark, tilting its head, watching, waiting. Even now, months after that night, I avoid dimly lit streets, foggy highways, and the edge of forests. I take well-lit roads, we stay in public areas, but the memories linger, along with the subtle whispers that sometimes crawl into my mind. Sometimes late at night, when the world is still, I swear I can see a figure in the distance, impossibly thin, limbs too long, head tilted, smiling. I tell myself it's imagination, fatigue, the tricks of shadows and fog, but deep down I know better. That night, on that back road, I was seen, marked, watched, and no amount of distance, light, or rationality will ever fully undo that. Fear, I've learned, is patient. It waits, it watches. And sometimes when the world is quiet, it comes closer. Some things are not meant to be seen. Some things are not meant to be understood. And when you encounter them, when they notice you, the feeling never leaves. The silence becomes suffocating, the shadows hostile, and every small tap, every whisper, every shift of darkness carries with it the unmistakable weight of awareness. I know now that whatever waits in those foggy stretches of road, in the stillness of night, in the corners of vision is not human. It is patient, and it is eternal, and it remembers. Always. I have learned to live with it, to recognize it, to respect its presence. But the knowledge is a curse. The feeling of being observed never fades, and the moment the night grows heavy, the wind dies, and the world falls silent, I feel it again, the impossibly thin figure tilting its head, smiling that unnatural smile, waiting, patient, and eternal, reminding me that no matter where I go, no matter how far I drive, the memory of that night and the presence of that thing will never leave. Story the end. It was one of those nights where everything outside the window looked like it had stopped moving. The wind wasn't blowing, no dogs barked in the distance, not even the sound of crickets. Just a thick silence, heavy enough that you could feel it pressing against the glass. I was staying in a small house on the outskirts of Muncie, Indiana, a place my cousin had rented for me while I was between apartments. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, old hardwood floors that creaked if you shifted your weight wrong, and a long, narrow hallway that felt darker than it should have even with the lights on. I had only been there for about 2 weeks, and in that time, I hadn't gotten used to the stillness. During the day, it was fine. Sunlight came through the big living room window and made the place seem almost cozy. But once the sun went down, the house changed. The air seemed heavier, colder. The woods that stretched behind it seemed to swallow the light. Every sound echoed a little too long. I kept telling myself it was just a new place, an unfamiliar layout, new noises. That night I couldn't sleep. It was a little after midnight, and I was lying on the couch, scrolling through my phone with the TV on low just for background noise. A true crime documentary was playing, something about disappearances in rural areas, and it didn't help the unease I was already feeling. Around 12:30, my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin, Lisa. "Hey, you up?" I texted back, "Yeah, can't sleep." She replied, "Weird, I just had the strangest dream. You were standing in the hallway of the house, but your face was all wrong." I stared at the screen a minute before typing, "You're just trying to freak me out." She didn't reply right away. When the message finally came through, it said, "I'm serious. It didn't look like you. I'm not kidding. Lock the door." It was stupid, but I got up anyway and checked the front door. It was locked. I checked the back too. Locked. The place was so quiet that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from across the house. I stood there for a minute, staring at the window above the sink that looked out into the woods. It was pitch black outside, just my faint reflection in the glass. I went back to the couch, but something about that message kept sitting wrong in my stomach. I started thinking about what she said. Your face was all wrong. I turned off the TV, and that was when I heard it. A soft, distinct creak from the hallway. I froze, phone still in my hand. It wasn't the sound of the wood settling. I knew that sound already. This was the long, slow creak of weight on old boards, like someone was trying to walk quietly. The house had a straight hallway that connected the living room to the bedrooms. From where I was on the couch, I could see the dark mouth of that hallway, but nothing beyond it. I waited, holding my breath, the sound not repeating. My first thought was that maybe I'd left a window open and the wind had shifted something, but then I remembered the air was dead still. Not even a breeze outside. I turned the TV back on for noise, but kept the volume low, straining to listen. A few minutes passed. Nothing else. I finally told myself I was being stupid and went to brush my teeth, trying to convince my brain to wind down. When I turned the bathroom light on, it flickered once before coming steady, and I caught my reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked tired, hollow. I was thinking about what Lisa said again, about my face being wrong, and I almost laughed at how ridiculous it was. Then I heard it again, that creak, closer this time. It came from right outside the bathroom. I turned off the faucet and listened. There was a long stretch of silence, and then another step. Slow, careful. The hallway floorboards groaned. I felt a wave of cold move up my back. The only light in the house was the one above me, and the door was halfway open, showing a sliver of the hallway. My instinct told me not to move, but curiosity pulled harder. I leaned toward the gap, my heart thudding so loud I thought it might drown the sound out. I waited. Something moved just past the doorway. A shadow. Not big, human-sized, but it shifted like it was leaning against the wall. Then a soft sound, like a quiet exhale. I jerked the door wide open, the light spilling into the hallway. Nothing. It was empty. The air was still again. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stepped out, glancing toward the living room. Everything was exactly where I left it. The couch, the TV still playing quietly, my phone on the armrest. No sign of anything out of place. I told myself it had to be the house. Old wood expands and shifts. It creaks. Maybe I'd heard my own echo or a mouse in the walls. That was all. I turned off the bathroom light and headed to the bedroom. But the second I turned off the hallway light, I caught movement again. This time it was in the reflection of the TV screen. I froze mid-step. The faint, dark reflection showed the hallway behind me. I could see my outline, but behind it for just a second, there was another, taller, still. Then it was gone. I spun around, heart hammering. The hallway was empty, but that time I knew what I'd seen. Not imagined, seen. I turned on every light in the house after that, every single one. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, both bedrooms. I went through the place from corner to corner, opening closets, checking behind doors. No one was there. The windows were all locked, the doors secured. I even checked under the bed like a child, feeling half crazy for doing it. By the time I was done, it was almost 2 a.m. I sat back on the couch, exhausted but wired, lights still blazing. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was my phone buzzing against my chest. It was a text from Lisa again. "Did you see it yet?" I blinked at the screen, confused. "See what?" I typed back. No response. "Lisa?" Nothing. I called her, but it went straight to voicemail. I checked the time. 3:03 a.m. The TV was still on, but the screen had gone black. That faint reflection was back again, my dim outline surrounded by the glow of the room. And then something moved in the reflection. Not me, behind me. I didn't even think. I bolted up and spun around. The light over the kitchen table flickered once. The air in the house had changed. It felt electric, heavy, like before a thunderstorm. I could hear something faint from the hallway, something like whispering. It was too soft to make out, but it was there. I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on, sweeping it down the hallway. The beam landed on the closed bedroom door at the end. The whispering stopped instantly. I don't know why I walked toward it. I should have left. I should have called someone. Gone outside, anything. But I couldn't. It was like something was pulling me toward that door, slow and deliberate. When I reached it, I put my ear against the wood. Silence. Then, one soft knock. From the other side. I jumped back, flashlight shaking in my hand. My first instinct was to run, but instead I reached for the doorknob. My hand was trembling so bad I could barely grip it. The metal was cold. I turned it, inch by inch, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, completely empty, except for the open window. The curtain moved just slightly, like something had gone through it. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't opened it. The woods were just beyond, pitched black, the tree line looking like a jagged wall against the faint moonlight. That was enough. I closed the window, locked it, grabbed my car keys, and walked straight out the front door without even turning the lights off. I drove to a 24-hour diner off the highway and sat there till morning, drinking bad coffee and trying to convince myself that it was just exhaustion or a bad dream. When the sun came up, I went back, half expecting to find signs of a break-in. But there was nothing. Everything was the same. No footprints by the window, no signs anyone had been inside. That day, Lisa finally texted me back. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "I didn't mean to scare you last night, but I keep having the same dream. There's something in that house. It looks like you, but it's not." That night, I stayed in a motel. I told myself I'd go back the next day to grab my stuff. But when I got there, I couldn't make myself go inside. The place just looked wrong. Even from the driveway, I could tell something was off. The blinds in the living room were twisted, and I could see faint movement through the slats, like someone was walking slowly from one side of the room to the other. I called out, nothing. The air felt heavy again, like that night. I turned and got back in my car. That house is still there. I never went back inside. My cousin eventually told the landlord I moved out early. He said that was fine, but told her something strange. Apparently, the tenant before me had left in the middle of the night too. No forwarding address, no explanation. Sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night with that same heavy silence pressing against the walls. I'll glance toward the hallway and swear I see a darker patch in the dark, like someone standing there, watching. A few months after I left, Lisa sent me one last message about it. She said she'd stopped having the dream for a while, but last week it came back. This time she said the thing that looked like me wasn't standing in the hallway anymore. It was standing behind her bed. Story, the end. It was one of those nights that felt unnaturally still. The kind where every sound carried too clearly and every shadow seemed too deliberate. The kind of night that made you instinctively close your windows even if it wasn't cold, just to keep the quiet out. I had just finished a long day working at the small law office in town and was driving back to my house out on the edge of the woods. It wasn't too far from the highway, maybe 15 minutes down a dark county road that only a handful of people used regularly. I'd bought the house a few years back. Cheap, quiet, surrounded by trees and fireflies in summer. Back then, it felt peaceful. Lately, though, I'd started noticing that peace wasn't always the same as comfort. I was tired that night. It had been raining earlier, and the pavement still shone faintly under my headlights. When I pulled into my driveway, the sound of the gravel under the tires seemed too loud in the silence. My house was dark except for the faint glow from the kitchen window. I always left one light on so it wouldn't feel so empty when I came home. I got out of the car and slung my bag over my shoulder, locking the door before heading toward the porch. That's when I heard it, faintly, from somewhere beyond the tree line. It was hard to tell what it was at first. A rhythm, slow and uneven. Almost like footsteps, but they stopped whenever I did. I stood still for a long moment, holding my breath and listening. Nothing, just the drip of water from the eaves and the faint hum of the power lines. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer. They came close to the property sometimes. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to let it go. I made a sandwich, poured a glass of whiskey, and sat down at the kitchen table. My dog, Penny, a small beagle mix, padded over and sat at my feet, whining softly. I looked down at her. "What's wrong, girl?" Her ears were pricked, eyes fixed on the window, the one that faced the woods. I turned around. The light inside the kitchen reflected off the glass, so all I could see was my own faint reflection. But I swear, just before I stood up to pull the curtain closed, I thought I saw movement. Something shifting just beyond the first line of trees. I froze. It wasn't a clear shape, more like a suggestion of one. Something pale against the dark. I blinked and it was gone. I laughed under my breath, more out of nerves than amusement, and said to Penny, "It's nothing. Probably just the wind." But there wasn't any wind. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to every creak of the house, every settling sound that I normally ignored. At around 2 a.m., I heard something that definitely wasn't normal. It was faint but unmistakable. Footsteps on the porch. Slow. Deliberate. Penny started growling low in her throat, her hackles raised. I sat up, heart hammering. The porch light was motion sensitive. It should have come on. It didn't. I reached for my phone to call the sheriff's office, but I hesitated. What was I even going to say? That someone might be standing on my porch? I hadn't seen anything. Then came a soft knock. 3 times. Not hard. Just slow, like someone testing if I was awake. I sat there frozen for what felt like minutes, but I don't think I breathed once. The knocking stopped. After a while, I finally got up enough courage to tiptoe to the front window. I pulled the curtain aside just an inch. The porch was empty. I left the lights on for the rest of the night and fell asleep sometime near dawn. The next morning, I found something strange near the bottom step. Footprints. Bare footprints. They led from the dirt path at the edge of the woods to my porch and stopped right at the door. The ground was damp enough to leave prints, but I hadn't been outside barefoot, and these were large, long, narrow, the kind that didn't look right somehow. I crouched down, staring at them. They looked like they'd been pressed into the ground by someone walking slowly, almost dragging their feet. When I followed them back toward the tree line, they just stopped. There were no returning prints. That was the first night. Over the next week, things started happening more often. Always at night, always when it was dead silent. I'd hear tapping on the windows, sometimes soft, sometimes insistent. The motion light on the porch started flickering, sometimes turning on for no reason when I looked out and saw nothing there. Penny grew restless, barking at corners, refusing to go outside after sunset. Then came the second Saturday night. I had a friend named Carl who sometimes stopped by unannounced. He worked late shifts at the gas station on the main road. Around midnight, I saw headlights coming up the drive. I figured it was him. But the car never reached the house. The headlights stopped maybe halfway down the drive and then turned off. I waited a minute. 2. No one got out. I opened the door and called, "Carl?" Nothing. The driveway was empty. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, feeling that heavy stillness again pressing against my ears. I shone the beam toward the woods. The trees looked blacker than usual, their branches interlocking like ribs. I took a few steps forward, my boots crunching on the gravel. That's when the flashlight flickered and went out. I smacked it against my palm, but it stayed dead. Then, faintly from ahead, I heard whispering. Not words I could make out, just a soft murmur, like multiple voices blending together. I froze. It stopped the instant I turned my head toward it. I backed away slowly, heart racing, and got inside as fast as I could. I locked the door, pulled the blinds, and sat in the dark kitchen listening. I don't know how long I stayed there before I heard a car start back up somewhere down the road. The next morning, I saw tire marks in the dirt about halfway down my driveway, but they led away from my house, not toward it. When I called Carl the next day, he said he'd been at work the whole night. By that point, I couldn't deny something was happening. I even started keeping a notepad next to the bed to write down what I heard and when. 2:13 a.m., knocking on back window. 3:27 a.m., footsteps on porch again. 4 or 5 a.m., something brushing against wall outside bedroom. One night, I tried to record it. I set my phone on the kitchen counter, camera facing the back door. I left the light off and went to bed. Around 3 a.m., I heard the now familiar sound, faint tapping on the glass. When I checked the recording the next morning, there was a shape in the reflection of the window. It looked like a face, but not a full one, just the lower half. A mouth slightly open, lips pale. It was there for only 2 seconds, but it was enough. I didn't sleep the next night at all. I started spending my evenings in town after that, sometimes until late, sitting in the diner or driving aimlessly until I felt tired enough to risk going home. But no matter what time I returned, I always had that feeling like something was waiting for me, watching from the trees. A few weeks later, the sheriff finally came out. I didn't tell him everything, just that someone had been on my property, maybe trying to break in. He checked the area, found nothing. No footprints this time, no signs of forced entry. He said it was probably kids messing around, told me to install some cameras, so I did. 3 of them, one at the front door, one by the back, and one facing the tree line. That first night, nothing. The second night, the one facing the woods caught movement. It was around 2:47 a.m. The trees at the far edge of the yard swayed slightly, though there was no wind. Then, from between them, something stepped forward. The image was grainy, the night vision distorting the shape, but I could make out the outline of a person. Tall, thin, moving strangely. It looked like their limbs were too long, joints bending wrong. The figure walked a few steps toward the camera, then stopped. Just stood there for a full minute, head tilted. Then it turned and vanished back into the woods. I showed the footage to the sheriff the next day. He looked at it, frowned, and said, Could be a trick of the light, maybe someone wearing something. But he looked uneasy. That night, the woods were quiet again, too quiet. I didn't even hear the usual crickets. Around midnight, I was sitting in the living room when Penny started whining near the back door. I muted the TV and listened. Soft scratching. Not against the glass this time, against the wood of the door itself. Slow, deliberate. I crept closer, every instinct telling me not to. I could hear breathing on the other side, low and raspy, then a whisper so faint I almost missed it. "Let me in." I froze, my body locked in place. It didn't sound like a person. Not exactly. There was something off in the tone, too steady, too calm, like someone imitating a voice. "Let me in," it said again, a little louder. I backed away slowly, not making a sound, until I reached the hallway. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. When the deputies arrived 15 minutes later, there was no one there. They checked the woods, the road, everything. But when one of them shone his flashlight near the door, he stopped. "Sir," he said quietly, "you see this?" There were fingernail marks on the wood, deep ones, like someone had dragged their nails down slowly, pressing hard enough to splinter it. That was the last night I stayed there. I packed up the next morning, took Penny, and went to stay with my sister in town. But even after I left, things didn't stop. A few days later, my sister woke me up in the middle of the night. "There's someone outside," she whispered. We went to the window. Her house was in a suburban neighborhood, plenty of streetlights, no woods. But standing across the street, half in shadow, was a tall figure, not moving, just staring at the house. We called the police again, but by the time they came, whoever or whatever it was gone. After that, I stopped sleeping near windows. I ended up selling the house, taking a loss just to get rid of it. The new owners moved in last year. A couple months later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was the new owner. He asked if I'd ever had problems with someone coming onto the property at night. I didn't want to answer, but I asked him why. He said his dog had been barking for hours every night, staring at the trees. Then, a few nights ago, he'd found muddy footprints by the porch. Bare ones. They stopped right at the door. I hung up for that. Now, even though I live miles away, there are nights when I wake up suddenly, heart pounding, certain I've heard that same slow knocking again. Sometimes I look out the window before I can stop myself, and when I do, I swear I see it just beyond the edge of the streetlight's reach. A tall shape. Still. Watching. Waiting. Story. The end. It was one of those nights where even the wind seemed to have given up. The air hung heavy and unmoving over the small town of Elkhurst, tucked deep in northern Pennsylvania. It was mid-November, and the last of the leaves had already been swept away by the season's earlier storms. The streets were deserted, the kind of empty that felt deliberate, like the whole town was holding its breath. I was driving home from a friend's house that night. A short 10-minute drive stretched into an hour because of a detour. A fallen tree had blocked the main road, and I had to take the back route through the woods that curved behind old, forgotten farms and houses long left to rot. My old Honda's headlights caught the silhouettes of trees leaning over the narrow asphalt, skeletal branches clawing toward the sky. The only sound was the tires humming against the road and the occasional crunch of gravel when the edge of the shoulder crumbled beneath me. I wasn't drunk, just tired. We'd been watching a movie, drinking cheap beer, and talking about nothing that mattered. It was one of those nights you don't expect to remember, but you do, because something happens to burn it into your mind forever. The first strange thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint at first, a hint of rot, like wet leaves left too long in a pile. I rolled the window up, thinking maybe an animal had died nearby, but it didn't go away. It thickened, a sour, sickly odor that made my stomach tighten. Then my headlight swept across something on the side of the road. A bag, maybe, or a bundle of something dark. I slowed the car, curiosity wrestling with my better judgment. When I stopped, I realized it wasn't a bag, it was clothing. Torn, dirty, and laid out almost neatly, like someone had placed them there. A flannel shirt, jeans, and a single boot. There were no tracks in the thin layer of frost on the road, no sign of a struggle. Just the clothes, folded enough to look intentional. Something in me said, "Don't get out," but I did anyway. The cold hit me first, sharp, wet, alive somehow. My breath came out in fog. The trees pressed in close, the kind of dark that swallows the beam of a flashlight. I squatted near the pile and reached out with one hand, hesitating just before touching it. The fabric looked damp, almost shiny under the light. Then I saw something that froze me completely. A small patch of skin, pale, wrinkled, sticking out from beneath the shirt sleeve. It wasn't clothing at all. I stumbled back, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The thing lying there wasn't a full body, just part of one. An arm, severed clean at the shoulder. The fingers curled tight as if still gripping something. I scrambled back into the car, slamming the door, locking it without thinking. My headlights caught the arm again, and for one unbearable second, I thought I saw the fingers twitch. I gunned the car forward, tires skidding, engine whining. I didn't care where I was going, just away. I didn't even think to call the police until I hit the main highway again. My hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The dispatcher kept asking me to repeat myself. "You said it was an arm? Sir, can you confirm it was human?" "Yes, it was human," I shouted, glancing at the rearview mirror like something might be following me. "Just send someone out there." It was near County Road 14, about 5 miles from the detour. They said they would send a unit immediately and asked me to wait at a nearby gas station until someone could meet me. When the officers arrived, I told them everything. They drove back out with flashlights and dogs. I waited at the gas station, still trembling, drinking bitter coffee the clerk had given me for free. When they returned nearly 2 hours later, one of them, a tall man with a weary look, sat across from me and said quietly, "There's nothing out there." "What do you mean, nothing?" "I saw it. It was right by the ditch." We checked the ditch, both sides of the road. We searched the woods for a mile in every direction. There's no sign of an arm or clothing or anything, not even footprints. I just stared at him. My hands were still sticky from the steering wheel, and I could smell that same faint rot on my sleeves. "I didn't imagine it," I said. He sighed. "We're not saying you did, but there's nothing out there now." They let me go home after filing a report, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those fingers, the way they'd curled like they were still alive. I kept replaying the drive, wondering if I'd hit something without realizing it. But there'd been no blood on the car, no dent, nothing. The next morning, I drove back out to the spot in daylight, thinking maybe I'd gone crazy. The frost had melted, and the forest looked dull and harmless. But then I saw something else, something that made my blood run cold again. A shoe. A single brown boot sitting on the shoulder of the road, not the same one from last night. This one was smaller, like a woman's. And next to it, pressed into the damp dirt, was a handprint. Not from a glove, not faint or accidental, but deep, like someone had leaned on their hands and dragged themselves forward. The fingers were long, and the marks between them were furrowed like claw tracks. I backed away slowly, got in the car, and drove home without looking back. That should have been the end of it. But that night, around 2 a.m., my phone rang. The number was blocked. I answered without thinking, my voice groggy. There was breathing on the other end, slow, uneven, wet. Then a voice, hoarse, broken, whispered, "You left me there." My whole body went cold. "Who is this?" The line went dead. I barely slept. The next morning, I called the police again, but there was nothing they could do about an anonymous call. They told me to block unknown numbers and suggested I might have seen something traumatic that was affecting my perception. It felt like they thought I was losing it. For the next few nights, I barely left the house. I'd wake up at every sound, the floor creak, the hum of the refrigerator, and convince myself it was nothing. Until the 5th night. That's when I started hearing tapping. It came from the living room window, faint but rhythmic, like someone lightly drumming their nails against the glass. I lay in bed, frozen. My first thought was that it was branches, maybe the wind, but there was no wind that night. The air was perfectly still, the same dead stillness from the night I'd found the arm. I finally got up, heart pounding, and crept to the window. The curtains were drawn, and I stood there for a moment, listening. The tapping stopped. Then, through the fabric, a shadow moved. It slid across the window, slow, deliberate. I took a step back, then two, and reached for the baseball bat I kept near the couch. When I pulled the curtain aside, there was no one there. Just my own pale reflection staring back from the dark glass. But right where I'd heard the tapping, There were marks. 5 long streaks on the glass, smeared downward. They looked like finger marks, except they were too thin, too sharp, like something had dragged its nails across it. The next morning, I found muddy prints on the porch, barefoot, small, leading from the steps to the window and then back into the woods behind the house. I couldn't take it anymore. I told myself it was some sick prank, maybe one of my friends trying to scare me after I told them the story. I even called them. None of them admitted to it, and their voices sounded genuinely disturbed. That night, I decided to stay awake and watch. I turned off all the lights, sat in the living room with the bat across my lap, and waited. Hours passed. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of old wood. My eyelids grew heavy, and I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes again, it was darker, quieter. And then I realized I wasn't alone. I could feel it before I saw it, the sense that someone else was there, standing just beyond the edge of the room. I turned my head slowly, scanning the shadows. There, near the hallway that led to the kitchen, something moved. A faint shuffle, then another. "Who's there?" My voice came out cracked, too thin. No answer. But I heard breathing. Ragged, wet, uneven, just like the phone call. I stood, gripping the bat tighter. My mouth was dry. I took one step forward, then another, until I reached the light switch. I flicked it on. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I exhaled shakily, laughing under my breath, trying to convince myself it was exhaustion or nerves. But then, from the far end of the hall, I heard something dragging across the floor. Something heavy. And then it stopped. I ran into the bedroom, locked the door, and called 911 again. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line. I told her someone was in the house. I could hear movement outside the door, soft, careful, almost deliberate. Then a sound I'll never forget, fingers scraping lightly against the door, moving slowly downward, 1, 2, 3 times. Then silence. When the police arrived, they found the back door wide open. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no mud, just that same smell. The rot. Faint, but there. I stayed with my brother after that. For 2 weeks, I didn't go back home except once to grab some clothes. Everything felt wrong in that house. The smell never really went away. It clung to the walls, to the furniture, like smoke after a fire. Then, a few nights later, my brother's dog started barking at the back door around midnight. When we checked, there were muddy footprints again, barefoot, small, leading up to the porch. The same as before. It wasn't just me anymore. We called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the prints had faded. It had started raining lightly, washing them away. One of the officers, a younger guy who'd been on the earlier case, looked at me and said, "You sure you didn't piss someone off? This is starting to feel personal." That line stuck with me, because deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever was happening wasn't random. It was following me. After another sleepless week, I decided to move. I found a small apartment downtown, far from the woods. It was noisy, crowded, bright, exactly what I needed. I started to feel normal again, at least for a while, until one night about a month later, when I came home late from work. The elevator in my building was broken, so I took the stairs. The halls were dim, and I could hear a faint dripping sound somewhere. I didn't think much of it until I reached my door. There was something on the doorknob, a scrap of fabric, dirty flannel, torn and stiff, like it had been soaked and dried. My stomach twisted. I knew that pattern, the same red and black as the shirt I'd seen on the road that night. I dropped it immediately and stepped back. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the key into the lock. When I finally pushed the door open, everything inside was exactly how I'd left it, except for one thing. On the kitchen counter next to the sink was a single boot, the same kind I'd seen by the road. And on the window above the sink, 5 long streaks dragged downward. I moved out again the next morning. It's been 3 years now. I've changed towns twice since then. I don't drive at night anymore. I don't answer unknown calls. Sometimes I still catch that smell, faintly, in parking garages or wooded trails, and every time I get this crawling feeling on my skin. Last week I got a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single photo. Grainy, dark. It showed a stretch of road lined with trees, a car parked on the shoulder, my car, the headlights illuminating a shape on the ground, and in the corner of the photo, near the edge of the frame, was a hand, small, pale, and curled. I burned the letter that same night. But even now, when the nights are still and grim like that one, I swear I can hear faint tapping somewhere in the dark, steady, patient waiting. Story. The end. It was one of those nights when the world felt unnaturally still. No wind, no distant cars, no dogs barking, just an empty, motionless quiet that pressed down like a weight. I lived on the edge of a small town in southern Illinois in a one-story house surrounded by woods. At night, you could barely see where the tree line ended and the sky began. The forest always made strange noises after dark, snapping branches, rustling leaves. But that night, it was completely silent. It wasn't until much later that I realized how wrong that was. I'd gotten home late from work that night. I was a mechanic at a small garage off Route 19, and one of the guys called in sick, so I stayed to finish up the last two cars. By the time I locked up, it was almost 11:30. My drive home took about 20 minutes, most of it through narrow country roads that wound between fields and woods. I'd driven it hundreds of times. But that night, every mile felt heavier. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I remember glancing in my rearview mirror more than usual, like expecting to see headlights behind me even though no one was there. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I noticed something odd. My porch light was off. I always left it on when I went out at night. The bulb was new. I just changed it that week, so it shouldn't have been burned out. I tried the switch inside the entryway, but nothing happened. I figured maybe the breaker tripped or something, but the rest of the house lights worked fine. It wasn't a big deal at the time, just one of those small annoyances you shrug off when you're tired. I microwaved leftovers, showered, and settled into the couch with a beer. The quiet was nice at first, but after a while I started noticing how complete it was. No crickets, no wind, just the occasional faint ticking from the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator, the kind of silence that makes you start hearing your own pulse. Around midnight, I went to bed. My room faced the woods behind the house. I'd left the blinds open because I liked seeing the tree silhouettes against the moonlight. I remember lying there, trying to fall asleep, when I started hearing what sounded like light tapping on my window. Not steady tapping, but irregular, like something brushing the glass once, pausing, then again. My first thought was branches moving in the wind, except there wasn't any wind. The trees were still. I sat up and stared toward the window. The moon was bright enough that I could see the outline of the glass and the faint reflection of my own face. I waited. For a few seconds, nothing. Then another soft tap, 3 in quick succession. Tap, tap, tap. I told myself it had to be some animal. Maybe a raccoon climbed the side of the house or a bird got disoriented. I got up and pulled the blinds down. The tapping stopped. I must have stood there for a good minute, listening. When I didn't hear anything else, I got back in bed and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little creak in the house felt louder than normal. My mind kept replaying that tapping sound. At some point I drifted off, though I couldn't tell you when. What woke me up was a sharp, echoing sound from outside, like a stick snapping. I sat up instantly, heart pounding. My clock read 2:43 a.m. For a few moments I didn't move, just listened. Then came another sound, this time closer to the house. It wasn't footsteps exactly, more like the soft crunch of dry leaves under slow, deliberate weight. I slipped out of bed quietly and went to the window, lifting the edge of the blind with one finger. The moonlight spilled across the yard, pale and still. Nothing moved, but just before I was about to let the blind fall, I saw something, a dark shape near the tree line. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it looked like someone standing there, half hidden between the trunks. My first reaction was annoyance. Probably some drunk or a lost hunter, I thought. I went to grab my flashlight from the nightstand and aimed it out the window. The beam caught the trees, the grass, the fence, but no one. The spot where the figure had been was empty. I scanned back and forth a few times, then switched the light off. I figured whoever it was must have ducked out of sight. Still, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I kept watching, waiting for movement, but after a few minutes, the woods were just as lifeless as before. Eventually, I told myself I was imagining it. I went back to bed, though I left the flashlight on the nightstand this time. I lay awake for a long while, staring at the ceiling, trying to slow my heartbeat. At some point, I drifted into a shallow sleep filled with half dreams of movement outside my window. When morning came, Everything looked normal again. I went outside before work, mostly to prove to myself nothing had been there. The grass was damp with dew, and I walked toward the edge of the yard where I thought I'd seen the figure. The ground was soft, but I swear I saw footprints, bare footprints, faint but visible, leading from the woods to the side of the house. They stopped near my bedroom window. I crouched down to look closer. They weren't big, maybe the size of a small woman's or teenager's. The odd thing was how deep they were. Whoever made them must have been standing there for a while. I felt cold all of a sudden, though the morning was warm. I went inside without really thinking and locked every door and window. At work that day, I tried not to think about it. The image of those prints kept flashing in my head. That night, I borrowed a motion sensor light from the garage and installed it above the back door. I figured if someone came near the house, it'd go off and scare them away. The next few nights were uneventful. I didn't hear or see anything strange. By the third night, I convinced myself it had all been in my head. Then came Friday. It was just after 1 a.m. when I woke up again. I didn't know why at first, until I noticed a faint glow seeping through the window, the motion light. It was on. I sat up quickly and grabbed my flashlight. My pulse was pounding. I crept to the window and peeked outside. The light illuminated the yard behind the house, bright and harsh. At first, I didn't see anything. Then my eyes caught a small movement by the edge of the light's reach. Something, or someone, was standing just past the brightness, right at the border where the woods began. They weren't moving, just standing there. I couldn't make out their face, but I could tell they were facing the house. I froze, afraid to even breathe. After what felt like forever, the motion light clicked off. The yard fell dark again, but I could still feel eyes on me. I aimed my flashlight toward the spot and flicked it on. The beam hit the trees, but there was no one there. The next morning, I checked outside again. This time, there were clear prints, deeper, closer to the house. They circled near the back porch, then trailed off toward the woods. I found a small piece of fabric caught on the corner of the porch railing, gray, thin, like from a shirt. That's when I called the sheriff's office. The deputy who came out was polite but skeptical. He walked around, looked at the prints, and told me they could have been there for days. When I told him about the light and the tapping, he nodded but didn't write much down. Probably some kids messing around, he said. We've had reports before. I'll have a car do a drive-by tonight. That didn't make me feel any better. I stayed up late that night, sitting in the living room with the curtains drawn, TV muted. Every creak made me flinch. At around 1:20 a.m., I heard it again, the tapping on the window, this time from the living room. 3 soft taps, slow and deliberate. I froze in my chair, not even breathing. Then came another. Tap, tap, tap. I turned my head slowly toward the sound. The blinds were down, but I could see the faint shadow of something on the other side, a shape blocking out a sliver of moonlight. I stood up and reached for my flashlight, but before I could switch it on, the tapping stopped. Silence. Then from the back of the house, I heard the creak of the porch steps. Someone was back there. I moved quietly to the kitchen and grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I flipped the light switch by the back door, but the bulb flickered and went out instantly, just like the porch light had that first night. The motion light didn't come on either. I could hear breathing now. I swear to God it was faint but real, ragged, uneven, just on the other side of the door. I shouted, "Who's out there?" But my voice cracked halfway through. No response. Then something scraped slowly down the length of the door, like fingernails dragging across wood. That was enough for me. I backed away, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. I could barely get the words out, but the dispatcher told me to stay inside and lock myself in a room until the officers arrived. I went to my bedroom, locked the door, and waited, gripping the bat in both hands. It felt like forever before I saw flashing red and blue lights through the blinds. I heard the muffled voices of the deputies outside, the crunch of boots, the squeal of a radio. When one of them knocked and announced himself, I almost collapsed with relief. They didn't find anyone, of course. They said they'd checked the whole property, even the woods. The only thing they noticed were more footprints in the mud behind the porch and what looked like smudges on the glass, like someone had pressed their face against it. They told me to stay with someone for the night, just to be safe. I drove straight to my brother's house across town and didn't go back until the next afternoon. The daylight made everything seem less frightening, but the unease didn't fade. When I walked into the house, it felt different, like someone had been there. Nothing was out of place, but the air felt stale, charged. That evening, I noticed something else. My kitchen window had faint prints on the outside glass, small, narrow, and spaced strangely apart. And when I looked closer, I saw smudges shaped like lips as if someone had been whispering against the glass. I called the sheriff again, but by the time they came, a thunderstorm had rolled in and washed most of it away. For the next week, nothing happened. I barely slept, always listening, waiting for another sound. The deputies drove by a few nights in a row, but eventually stopped. Everyone I told, my coworkers, my brother, thought I was overreacting. Maybe I was. But then came the night that proved I wasn't. It was a Sunday, just after midnight. The storm had finally cleared, leaving the air damp and cold. I was sitting on the couch, trying to unwind, when I noticed the motion light outside flick on. I didn't move. I just watched the glow through the curtains. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful steps circling the house. The boards on the porch creaked, and I heard the doorknob rattle once, lightly. I stood up, every nerve in my body screaming. I didn't have time to grab the bat before the sound came again, this time from the front door. A low, rhythmic knocking. Not fast, not aggressive. Just 3 steady knocks. I froze. My phone was on the coffee table, but I couldn't move to reach it. The knocking came again, louder. Then, in a calm, almost whispering voice, I heard a woman say, "Please let me in." It wasn't a voice I recognized. It sounded wrong, strained, like someone trying to imitate being calm, but just missing it. I backed away slowly toward the hallway. The voice came again. "Please, I need help." I didn't answer. My whole body was shaking. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "I saw you watching me." I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly I was in my bedroom, locking the door again. I called 911, whispering into the phone. The dispatcher told me officers were on their way, and I should stay put. As I waited, I could hear her walking along the porch, dragging her hand across the wall as she moved. Then she started humming, a slow, tuneless hum that carried through the quiet night. By the time the deputies arrived, the humming had stopped. They found nothing again. No footprints, no sign of anyone. That was the last night I stayed in that house. I packed a bag and went to my brother's the next morning. I put the place up for sale a week later. A few months after I moved out, I got a call from the realtor. He said the new owners, an older couple, wanted to ask about the electrical wiring. He mentioned almost casually that they'd found something odd under the crawl space while doing repairs. A small blanket, a cracked mirror, and a pile of old clothes that looked like they'd been there for years. The sheriff's department came out again. They said the items looked like they belonged to a homeless woman who'd been reported missing from a nearby town 5 years earlier. They never found her body. Sometimes I think about that night, about the voice at the door, the lips on the glass, the footprints by my window, and I wonder if she ever really left those woods, or if she'd been living under my house the entire time, watching me sleep. Story the end. It was the kind of night that felt unnaturally still, like the world had been drained of movement and sound. The air outside was heavy and cold, not with the bite of winter, but with the kind of chill that clung to your skin even when the thermometer didn't justify it. I had been driving home late after visiting my parents in a small town just outside of Pittsburgh. The road that wound through the hills was quiet, lined with thick woods that seemed endless when the headlights cut through them. I'd made that drive dozens of times, but that night, something about it felt different from the start. I left my parents' house a little after 11 p.m. They lived in an old farmhouse on the edge of town, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was a mile away. The sky was overcast, not a single star visible. By the time I turned onto the county highway that would take me back toward the city, I realized how empty the world felt. No other cars, no animals crossing the road, just my headlights sliding across damp pavement and the black shapes of trees leaning toward me on both sides. I remember glancing at the clock on the dashboard, 11:37. It was around that time I noticed something odd, a shape on the shoulder of the road, just ahead in the beam of my headlights. It looked like a person standing perfectly still, facing the trees. I slowed down, instinctively reaching for the high beams. When the brighter light hit them, I saw a man wearing what looked like an old beige trench coat. His head was tilted downward, and his hands hung at his sides. I couldn't see his face, just dark hair and pale skin in the beam's edge. I slowed to a crawl as I passed. He didn't move. He didn't look up. I remember the way his shadow stretched unnaturally long across the asphalt behind him as my car rolled past. I told myself it was just someone waiting for help, maybe a broken-down car hidden further back in the trees. Still, when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw that he had turned. He was now facing the road, watching my car move away. A jolt of unease ran through me, but I tried to shake it off. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down again. A few miles later, I turned on the radio just to fill the silence, but every channel was static. Not just fuzzy reception, pure crackling static that filled the car. I turned it off and drove on in silence. The next town was about 15 miles away, but by the time I reached the old steel bridge that crossed the river, I started feeling like I was being followed. It wasn't a sound exactly, but more a weight in the air, like something was there just beyond my vision. I caught myself glancing at the mirror over and over again, expecting to see headlights. There were none. But every time I looked, that same stretch of black road seemed wrong somehow, like it bent in ways it shouldn't, like the darkness itself was leaning closer. I crossed the bridge slowly, the sound of the tires clanking over metal echoing too loudly. At the halfway point, I caught movement in the mirror. My heart kicked up. There was someone walking in the middle of the road behind me, the man from earlier. I could see the faint outline of his beige coat in the reflection. I pressed harder on the gas, crossing the rest of the bridge faster than I probably should have. When I looked again, the road behind me was empty, just darkness. My mind was racing now. Maybe he'd never been there. Maybe I was just seeing shadows where there weren't any. A few minutes later, I saw a light up ahead, a small convenience store that stayed open late for truckers. I pulled into the parking lot, relieved to see someone else for the first time in nearly an hour. There was one other car parked outside, a dusty pickup. Inside, the store was lit with harsh fluorescent light that buzzed faintly. A man behind the counter looked up as I came in. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, wearing a cap with the logo of a local high school team. "Evening," he said as I came up to the counter. "Hey," I replied, trying to sound normal. "Sorry, weird question, but have you seen anyone walking along the highway tonight? A man, maybe in a tan coat?" The clerk frowned slightly. "Out there?" He shook his head. "Ain't nobody out on that stretch this late. You sure you saw someone?" "Pretty sure," I said, though my voice wavered more than I wanted it to. He scratched the back of his neck. "That road gets foggy sometimes, tricks the eyes. A couple folks have said they've seen someone out there, though. Always the same story. Man in a tan coat standing by the trees. Local story, I guess. Some old accident back in the 70s. I stared at him. "An accident?" He nodded. "Guy was walking home from a bar one night, got hit by a car near mile marker 23. Died right there on the shoulder. They say the driver never stopped." I felt my stomach twist. "You think that's who I saw?" He shrugged. "I don't know. But if you saw him, you ain't the first." When I left the store, the night felt heavier than before. The sound of the wind in the trees behind the building almost sounded like whispers. I got back in the car, started the engine, and sat there for a moment staring at the empty road. I told myself to just drive home, to forget about it, but when I pulled out onto the highway again, I couldn't help glancing in the mirror. For the next few miles, nothing happened. The radio was still dead, my phone had no signal, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Then, just past a bend where the trees opened into a wide field, I saw headlights approaching from behind. Relief washed through me. Another car, finally. I slowed a bit to let it catch up, but the lights stayed far behind, matching my speed perfectly. I drove another 5 minutes, glancing back every so often. The headlights never got closer, never fell behind. Then, without warning, they flickered and vanished. I hit the brakes instinctively, scanning the dark road behind me. Nothing. No car. No lights. Just the reflection of my own taillights in the distance. That's when I noticed something on the side of the road again. A shape, standing just inside the tree line. My chest tightened. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it was the same man. The beige coat, the stillness, the way his head was tilted down slightly. I pressed the gas and didn't look again. By the time I reached the outskirts of the city, the unease hadn't left. I parked in front of my apartment and sat there for a long moment before getting out. The air was perfectly still again, not even a hint of wind. I remember thinking the world seemed too quiet for midnight. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to shake it off. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Not at first. It felt too strange to even explain. But over the next few days, little things started happening that made it impossible to ignore. The first was the knocking. It started faintly, around the third night after the drive. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning to a slow, deliberate knock on my front door. 3 knocks, then silence. I froze in bed, listening. My apartment was on the second floor, facing a small courtyard that stayed empty at night. Nobody ever came up those stairs without buzzing first. After a minute, I got up and went to the peephole. The hallway light flickered faintly. There was no one there. I waited, staring through the peephole, my heartbeat loud in my ears. Then I noticed something. The shadow under the door, long, stretched out, shifted slightly, like someone had just stepped back. I didn't open it. I stood there until my legs started shaking and went back to bed. The next morning, I checked the hallway again. Nothing. But there were faint, wet footprints on the concrete landing outside my door, leading away toward the stairs. The second thing happened a few nights later. I was in the shower when I heard it, a soft tapping sound on the bathroom window. I froze, soap still in my hair. The window was small and frosted, facing the back alley. I turned off the water and listened. Tap, 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 slow and steady. I grabbed a towel, wiped enough steam off the glass to peek through. For a second, I thought I saw the faint outline of a handprint on the outside. Then it was gone. I barely slept that night. The following evening, I decided to take a walk just to clear my head. I went down to the small park near the river, a place where I sometimes sat after work. It was late, past 10, and the park was empty. The sound of water moving under the bridge nearby was the only thing breaking the stillness. I sat on a bench, staring out at the reflection of the streetlights on the river, trying to convince myself that all of this was in my head. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from behind me, slow and uneven, like someone dragging one foot slightly. I turned. There was a man standing by the edge of the path. Beige coat, head tilted down. I stood up fast, heart pounding, and took a step back. "Hey!" I shouted, though my voice cracked halfway through. He didn't move, didn't even look up, just stood there, perfectly still. I started walking backward toward the parking lot. Every few steps, I glanced up. He was still there, watching. When I finally turned and ran, the sound of footsteps started again, matching my pace. I reached my car, slammed the door, locked it, and started the engine. When the headlights came on, he was gone. I didn't go home right away. I drove around the city for hours, stopping only when the sky started to lighten. When I finally got back to my apartment, there was something waiting on the doorstep. A small, folded piece of paper, damp from dew. I picked it up and opened it. Inside, in shaky handwriting, were 5 words. "You shouldn't have stopped." I dropped it instantly, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was no one around. The morning light was thin and gray, the air heavy with fog. I ran upstairs and locked the door behind me. For the next week, I barely left my apartment. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man standing by the road, his face hidden in shadow. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. The knocking came back, sometimes on the door, sometimes on the window, always in sets of 3. I'd look through the peephole and see nothing. One night, I set up my phone to record video facing the door while I slept. The next morning, I watched the footage. Around 3:14 a.m., the screen went slightly fuzzy, like the signal was glitching. Then, for a fraction of a second, I saw it, just a flash of movement outside the door. A dark shape, tall and still. The footage cut out. I sent it to a friend, Mark, who worked in IT. He thought it might have been a compression issue, maybe some kind of interference. But when he tried to adjust the levels and zoom in, the frame showed something else, what looked like a hand pressed flat against the door. Pale. Too long. I moved out 2 weeks later. I found another apartment across town, newer building, higher floor, with a lobby and cameras. For a while, things were quiet. I tried to forget about it, though sometimes I'd still catch myself glancing at windows at night. But one evening, as I was walking back from the grocery store, I noticed something across the street. A man, standing under a flickering streetlight, head down, beige coat hanging loose. I froze. The light flickered again, and he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me tense. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, all of it sounded too sharp. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the front door. I sat in bed, staring at the door across the dark living room. Then my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. I opened it. It said, "Look outside." My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned toward the window. The blinds were closed, but faint light from the street filtered through. I didn't move. The phone buzzed again. I'm here. I stood up, walked to the window, and pulled one slat of the blinds down. He was standing in the parking lot below, directly under the streetlight, head tilted down just like before. I dropped the blinds and stepped back, my hands shaking. I called 911, stammering through what was happening. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and that a unit was on its way. I didn't hang up. 10 minutes passed, maybe less. When I heard the knock again, I almost screamed. 3 slow knocks. The officers arrived about 5 minutes later. They checked the lot, the hallways, everything. There was no one there. But when one of them shined his flashlight near the building entrance, he found something pressed into the dirt by the stairs. A single wet footprint. Bare. I didn't stay long after that. I moved again, this time to another state, taking a job in Ohio. For a while, things seemed normal. I told myself I'd imagined parts of it, that it was exhaustion, stress, maybe even some lingering trauma from that drive. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It's been 3 years now. I haven't seen him since. But sometimes, when the night is still and the air feels heavy, I'll wake up and hear it again. 3 faint knocks, somewhere far off, like the sound is traveling through the walls. And every time I remember the note, "You shouldn't have stopped." Story the end. It was one of those nights when everything outside felt too still, too quiet, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The kind of night where even the crickets seem to know something's wrong and go silent. I remember that evening vividly, because every time I think back to it, I can feel that same oppressive stillness pressing against my chest. I was living alone back then, in a small town outside of Topeka, Kansas. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship, and I was in that stage where you convince yourself solitude is healing, even when it's slowly twisting into something darker. The house was old, one of those single-story rentals with warped floorboards, drafty windows, and a basement that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1940s. It wasn't much, but it was cheap, and I told myself it would be temporary. That night, I was sitting in the living room with the lights off, just the faint orange glow from the streetlight seeping through the blinds. I'd been watching some late-night true crime show, but after the episode ended, I didn't bother changing the channel or turning the TV off. The static hum filled the background like white noise, and I just sat there, zoning out, sipping on a beer gone flat. The house made sounds, the way all old houses do. Pops, groans, the faint whine of pipes when the water heater kicked in. Normally, I ignored it, but that night, the noises were different, sharper, almost deliberate. Around midnight, I heard something from the back room, a dull thump, like something falling off a shelf. I assumed it was the wind. Kansas nights were unpredictable, and the house wasn't well insulated. But when I got up and started down the hallway, I noticed the air felt colder, not just cooler, but as if I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. I could see my breath fog slightly as I passed the second bedroom, the one I didn't use. I'd been keeping the door shut since moving in. Not for any real reason, just habit. When I reached the end of the hall, I saw that the door to that room was open. Now I knew for a fact I hadn't opened it. The latch on that door was stiff, and it always made a distinct scraping sound when it opened. I would have noticed. I hesitated, hand hovering near the light switch, but something in my gut told me not to turn it on, so I didn't. I just stood there, staring into the darkness. I could barely make out the outlines of furniture, a dresser, the faint square of the window. But there was something else, too, something darker than the rest of the room. It wasn't moving, but I could feel it, like how you can feel someone watching you even before you see them. I backed away slowly, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the door. I pulled it shut and pressed the old brass latch down until it clicked. Then I went back to the living room and sat there in silence, listening. The rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I left the TV on, the static hum somehow less unnerving than the silence. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something faint, a creak, a soft shuffle, but I kept telling myself it was just the house settling. The next morning, when sunlight finally came through the blinds, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd left the door cracked and the draft had pushed it open. That night just became one of those strange, unsettling moments you tuck away and try not to think about. But it didn't stop there. Over the next week, I started noticing little things around the house. I'd leave a glass on the counter, come back later, and it would be on the table. The back door would be unlocked, even though I knew I'd locked it. The thermostat kept dropping a few degrees during the night, even after I replaced the batteries. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, like damp earth or old mildew. I figured it was coming from the basement. The landlord had warned me not to mess around down there because of possible mold. But the smell wasn't coming from the basement door. It was stronger near the hallway. One morning, I finally decided to open that second bedroom again. Sunlight was streaming through the dusty window, and the room looked empty. Just an old dresser, some leftover wallpaper peeling from the corners, but the smell hit me like a wave, sour, musty, and thick. I pulled open one of the dresser drawers, and a cloud of dust burst out. Nothing inside but a few yellowed papers, faded with age. I picked one up carefully. It was a letter, written in neat cursive, dated November 3rd, 1964. It said, "I can't stay here anymore. The noises don't stop, even during the day. They call my name from under the floor." I told Harold, but he won't listen. He says it's in my head, but I know what I've heard. I'm leaving before it makes me do something I'll regret. The rest was smudged, the ink bleeding into the paper. I remember just standing there, reading that over and over, trying to make sense of it. The name Harold stuck out to me. Later that afternoon, I called the landlord and asked him about the house's history. He was an older guy, probably in his 70s, and when I mentioned the letter, he went quiet. Then he sighed. "You found something, huh?" "Yeah, the place has had a few renters over the years. Used to belong to a couple back in the 60s. Harold and Elaine Martin. She went missing, never found. He stayed for a while after, but eventually moved out. No one's lived there long since." I asked what happened, but he said, "It's not my business to talk about. That house has its moods. Best to keep the windows open and don't think too much about it." Then he hung up. I didn't like that answer, but I didn't push it. That night, the air felt heavy again. The smell was stronger, like wet dirt and iron. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of faint whispering. I thought maybe the TV had turned on by itself, but when I went to the living room, it was dark. The whispers were coming from down the hall. It sounded like two voices, a man and a woman, low, murmuring, almost arguing, but too soft to make out words. I stood frozen for what felt like a full minute, just listening. Then, without really thinking, I stepped closer. The voices stopped. I switched on the hall light. The bulb flickered once, then went out. The hallway plunged into darkness again. My stomach dropped as I heard that same scraping sound, the sound of the door to the second bedroom creaking open. I turned and saw it slowly swinging inward, an inch at a time, as though someone was pulling it from the other side. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then from inside the room, I heard something slide across the floor, something heavy. That was enough to break my paralysis. I turned and bolted for the front door, barefoot, grabbing my keys off the counter. I didn't stop until I was standing in my car, gasping for air, hands shaking so hard I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I slept in the car that night, parked 2 blocks away. When I went back the next morning, daylight made it all seem absurd. The door was open, yes, but nothing else looked disturbed. The dresser was still there, the letter still where I'd left it. The air smelled normal again. I told myself I was losing it. Maybe stress, maybe loneliness, maybe I dreamt it. So I tried to live normally. I stopped going down the hall at night, kept the door shut again, left more lights on. For a few days, things quieted down. No smells, no voices, no cold spots. I started to think it was finally over. Then one evening I came home from work to find the front door slightly ajar. My stomach dropped immediately. I knew I'd locked it that morning. I stepped inside cautiously, listening. Everything looked fine. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing. I went to the kitchen, then down the hallway. That was when I noticed footprints on the floor. They were muddy, barefoot, small, like a woman's. They led from the front door to the second bedroom. My pulse started pounding in my ears. I followed them, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I noticed it was wide open. Inside, the dresser drawers were pulled out and stacked in a strange pattern like steps leading to the window. And on the windowsill, there was something that hadn't been there before, something wrapped in newspaper. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was an old, yellowed photograph of a woman. Her hair was curled in that 1960s style, her face soft but expressionless. Scrawled across the bottom in faint pencil were the words, Elaine, 1963. The air went cold again. I felt something brush against the back of my neck, light, like a fingertip. I spun around, but the room was empty. Only the faint scent of earth lingered. That night, I didn't stay. I went to a motel off Highway 24, didn't even pack a bag, but even there, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that faint whispering again, like it had followed me. The next morning, I went back to the house with the landlord. I told him everything about the voices, the footprints, the letter, the photo. He listened quietly, eyes fixed on the hallway as I talked. When I finished, he sighed deeply and said, I should have told you more when you moved in. He walked over to the second bedroom and pointed at the floor near the dresser. That's where they found Harold, he said. Shot himself in the chest. Police said he'd been dead for days before anyone noticed. They never found his wife. Folks said she just vanished one night, but Harold used to tell people he could hear her moving around the house, said she was under the floorboards. He kicked lightly at one of the floor planks. I've had it redone a few times, but... He trailed off. Sometimes the boards shift again. I moved out that same week, left half my stuff behind. For a while, I didn't tell anyone about it. Who would believe me? But even after I left, I couldn't shake it. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up and smell that same damp, earthy scent. I'd hear a faint scrape somewhere in the room, like wood shifting. Once, I even woke to find mud prints near my bed, small, barefoot, fading into the carpet. I started looking up records about the Martins. It took some digging, but I eventually found an archived article from November 1964. It said Elaine Martin disappeared after neighbors reported loud arguments and gunshots. Police questioned Harold, but found no evidence of foul play. He insisted Elaine had gone underground, whatever that meant. He told police she'd been acting strange, talking about voices in the floor and hearing her name at night. A few weeks later, Harold was found dead in that same house. The article ended there. No mention of any burial, no follow-up. That was over 50 years ago, but when I drove past that street a few months later, the house was still there. New tenants had moved in, young couple, maybe early 30s. Kids' toys scattered in the yard. For a moment I thought about stopping, warning them. But what would I say? Hey, just so you know, there's something under the floorboards that whispers your name. So I didn't. But sometimes, when the night feels too still and the air too cold, I think about that woman, the one who said she was leaving before it made her do something she'd regret. I think about those muddy footprints, the smell of wet soil, and that faint whisper that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I don't live in Kansas anymore. I've moved twice since then, farther east each time, but every so often I'll wake up around 2 a.m. and hear that same slow, dragging scrape across the floorboards beneath me. I tell myself it's just the house settling, but deep down I know better. Story the end. It was the kind of night where the air felt too heavy to breathe right. No breeze, no sound, not even the hum of crickets. Just that hollow silence that presses in from all sides, thick and uneasy. I remember because that was the first thing that made me notice how wrong the night felt. I was alone in my small rental house on the outskirts of Boone, North Carolina. It sat half buried in the shadow of a wooded ridge, about 20 minutes from town. The nearest neighbor was a retired mechanic named Roy, whose place was almost invisible through the trees unless his porch light was on. Mine wasn't. I kept the lights low most nights, partly because I was cheap with power and partly because I liked the dark. I had been living there for 4 months. The house had this quiet charm at first. A wraparound porch, a creaky screen door, even an old wood stove that worked surprisingly well. The landlord had told me it used to belong to a game warden who passed away alone in the house back in the late 90s. No wife, no kids. He was the sort who liked quiet, the landlord had said. At the time, that sounded like me too. I was 31, divorced, and done with city noise. The idea of being tucked into the trees, surrounded by nothing but the night, seemed perfect. But nights like that one, grim and unnervingly still, make you realize silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it feels like something waiting. I'd been watching an old movie, barely paying attention, when I realized something was off with the sound in the house. It was subtle at first. The movie's dialogue just seemed quieter, so I turned up the volume. But it wasn't the movie, it was the air itself. Everything else had gone completely silent. The refrigerator hum had stopped. Even the wind that usually stirred the branches behind the house was gone. I paused the movie, my ears strained in the silence, waiting for the normal background noise to come back. It didn't. Then I heard the faintest shuffle outside the window to my right. Just one small movement. I froze. My heart jumped so hard it made my stomach ache. There were no footsteps after that, but the hair on my arms lifted like static. The sound wasn't like an animal scurrying in leaves. It was softer, slower, as if someone was deliberately brushing against the wall. I told myself it was just my imagination. The night plays tricks when it's that still. I turned the TV back on, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see a face looking in. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself maybe a raccoon or stray dog was wandering around, but the feeling didn't go away. A few minutes later, there was another sound, this time on the porch, the faint hollow creak of wood bending under weight. My porch had that distinctive sound whenever you stepped on it. It gave this soft moan before settling. I muted the TV again and listened. Creak, then stillness, another creak. Someone or something was walking slowly along the porch. I got up, heart hammering, and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I didn't own a gun, just a heavy mag light and a rusted hatchet I used for splitting kindling. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide if I should turn on the porch light first or just open the door fast and catch whoever it was. But fear has this way of paralyzing logic. My breathing got so loud it drowned out the quiet outside. I flicked on the light. The porch was empty. The night beyond it stretched black and endless, trees barely visible against the faint haze of moonlight. I stepped outside and scanned with the flashlight beam, the railing, the steps, the yard, all clear. The air was cold, damp, and too quiet. I waited for another sound, but there was nothing. After a while, I went back inside. I told myself maybe it was just the wood settling, or maybe a deer brushed up against the side. But deep down, I knew the sound of footsteps. I'd heard enough of them walking on that same porch to know it was human weight. I tried to go to bed later, but sleep didn't come easy. The silence pressed down harder the longer I lay there. I kept thinking about that porch, about the way the boards creaked slow and deliberate. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard it again. Just one faint groan of wood. I sat up, heart pounding, but didn't move this time. I stared at the ceiling until morning. The next day, I tried to laugh it off with Roy when I saw him walking his dog near the property line. "You ever get raccoons on your porch at night?" I asked. Roy shook his head. "Not this far up. Coyotes, sometimes. You hear them in the fall, mostly. Why?" "Just thought I heard something last night. Sounded like someone walking." He looked at my house for a second. "You're up here alone, right?" "Yeah." He chewed on his lip like he wanted to say something, then shrugged. "You'll hear things sometimes. Old wood houses like that creak. Sound carries weird through these trees, too." I nodded, though it didn't feel convincing. That night, I made sure to lock everything. Doors, windows, even the cellar hatch out back. I checked twice before sitting down to eat. The unease didn't leave, though. Something about that silence kept bothering me. The woods around the property seemed to swallow sound whole. Even the occasional owl seemed muffled. Around midnight, I was washing dishes when I noticed the reflection in the kitchen window. Something moved past the edge of the glass. A shadow, tall, almost blending into the night. I spun around. but the yard was empty when I looked out. My pulse jumped. I turned off the light so I could see better through the glass. That's when I saw it. Standing near the tree line, maybe 40 feet from the porch, was a shape. Tall, still, facing the house. No movement, no sound. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a person. Broad shoulders, head slightly tilted like they were watching me. My throat closed up. I blinked, and the shape was gone. Just the trees again, shadows overlapping. But I swear, for that brief second, someone had been there. I stayed up the rest of the night with the flashlight beside me, every creak of the floorboards setting me on edge. Over the next week, the feeling that I wasn't alone grew worse. Small things started happening. I'd find my porch light unscrewed, my doormat moved. Once I came home from work to find muddy footprints leading up to my back door. Barefoot, adult-sized. The police came out when I reported it, but they didn't find anything. They told me it was probably some drifter passing through, maybe a hiker. But it kept happening. Every night around the same time, the silence would settle, and I'd hear something outside. Slow steps, brushing against the walls, sometimes what sounded like quiet breathing near the windows. I tried leaving lights on, but it didn't help. Whoever, or whatever, it was seemed to know when I was watching. The breaking point came about 2 weeks later. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of someone tapping on the glass. Not knocking, tapping. Light and rhythmic, like a fingernail against the window pane. It was coming from the living room. I froze in bed, barely breathing. The tapping stopped, then started again, slower this time. I reached for my flashlight and crept toward the sound. My feet made almost no noise on the old wood floor, but my heartbeat felt deafening. The tapping stopped just as I got to the doorway. I flicked on the flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Nothing. The window was clear. Then I saw it, just faintly, on the glass. Smudges. 5 of them. Like fingerprints pressed against the inside of the window. Inside. I backed away so fast I tripped over the rug and hit the floor. My flashlight rolled away, spinning light across the walls. I scrambled up and ran for the front door, but when I reached it, I realized the chain was still on. I hadn't even heard it open. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him I was thinking of moving. He didn't sound surprised. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That place has had issues. I can waive your lease if you want." "What kind of issues?" I asked. He paused. "The game warden who lived there before you, he wasn't the only one who died in that house. His brother stayed there after him for a while. Went missing. They never found him. People say he used to wander at night, checking traps, talking to himself. Some folks around here think he never really left." I didn't know what to say. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept every light on, flashlight in hand. Around 1 a.m., the silence came back. The kind that felt wrong. Heavy. My stomach sank. Then the footsteps started again, slow and measured across the porch. This time, they didn't stop. They came to the door. I saw the faint outline of a figure through the curtain. Someone was standing there, just beyond the glass. My breath caught in my throat. The handle turned, gently, like someone testing if it was unlocked. I didn't move. The door rattled once, twice, then silence. For a long time, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself it was over when I noticed something strange. The curtain over the window was moving, just slightly, like air was being pushed against it. Then, from the other side of the glass, came a whisper. I swear it was right against the window. "You shouldn't be here." I dropped the flashlight. The voice was low, rasping like it had been dragged up through dry leaves. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I backed away slowly, eyes locked on the curtain. The whisper came again, this time softer. "He doesn't like you here." I ran. Straight out the back door, barefoot into the yard. I didn't stop running until I reached Roy's house, pounding on his door like a maniac. When he opened it, I must have looked half insane. He didn't ask questions, just let me in. I stayed there until morning. When we went back to my place, the front door was wide open. Everything inside was untouched, except for one thing. On the inside of the living room window, written in the fog from my own breath, were the words, "Get out." Roy helped me pack that day. I never went back after that night. I left half my stuff behind. The landlord didn't charge me a thing. A few months later, I got a call from him. He said a new tenant had moved in, but lasted only a week. They said they heard someone whispering through the walls at night. I tried to forget about that house, But sometimes, late at night when everything's quiet, I still hear that faint tapping sound in my head. It's not loud, but it's enough to make me turn on the lights, just to be sure. And every so often, when the night is grim and still and the air feels wrong again, I can almost hear that same dry whisper just behind my shoulder, reminding me that some silences aren't empty. They're listening. Story the end.